When we talk about death, we are often met with discomfort or even outright avoidance. It's one of those topics that people prefer not to think about, let alone discuss openly. We live in a society where death has become the ultimate taboo, something to fear, something to postpone, something to pretend doesn't exist until it finally shows up, uninvited, at the door. Death, for many, is the unwelcome guest who sits silently in the corner of the room, casting a shadow over every joyful moment, every achievement, every experience we hold dear. The notion of death is so wrapped in anxiety that we've created entire industries to fight it, mask it, or prolong its arrival. We develop creams, diets, surgeries, and even apps to stave off the aging process, the telltale signs that the inevitable is drawing nearer. Hospitals are designed to shield us from the dying process, and the moment someone passes, they are whisked away quickly, almost as if their mere presence could remind us too much of what lies ahead for each of us. Why do we do this? Why do we as a culture put death in a corner, shrouded in fear and silence? Alan Watts, a thinker who often brushed up against society's most well-protected taboos, invites us to ask a different question. Why is death treated as something unnatural, when, in reality, it is perhaps the most natural event we will ever encounter? In many ways, the Western attitude toward death is rooted in our obsession with control. We live in a world that thrives on predictability, on explanations, on knowing what's coming next. From the moment we are born, we are conditioned to believe that our lives should move in a particular direction: education, career, family, retirement. And within that plan, death is often seen as the tragic interruption, the unwelcome closing act. We are taught to value permanence, to see stability as the ultimate goal. But death shatters that illusion. Death reminds us that we are not in control, that life is fleeting, unpredictable, and impermanent. In contrast, Watts asks us to consider death not as a failure of life, but as an intrinsic part of it. He suggests that by ignoring or fearing death, we lose sight of a deeper truth: that death is not the enemy, but a profound teacher, a reminder of life's ephemeral beauty, an invitation to live more fully in the present. This perspective is, of course, quite alien to Western minds. In the West, we tend to compartmentalize life and death, viewing them as opposites. Life is something to be cherished and clung to, while death is something to be dreaded and avoided at all costs. But Watts, drawing heavily on Eastern philosophies such as Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism, encourages us to see things differently. He invites us to consider the possibility that life and death are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a greater whole. In Taoism, for example, we find the concept of yin and yang, opposite yet interconnected forces that are constantly in flux. Just as day turns to night and night into day, life transitions into death, and death into life. In this view, death is not the antithesis of life, but its partner in an eternal dance. This non-dualistic approach, which sees the interconnectedness of all things, was central to Watts's thinking. He often spoke of the futility in trying to separate life from death, as though they were two independent events rather than two sides of the same coin. This idea of death as a natural, even necessary part of life is echoed in Buddhism as well. In Buddhist thought, the concept of impermanence, anicca, is fundamental. Everything is in a state of constant change, from the tiniest atom to the grandest star. Nothing remains the same, and to cling to any notion of permanence is to invite suffering. Death, in this framework, is simply the most obvious manifestation of impermanence, a reminder that life itself is a temporary and precious experience. Watts, in his characteristic way, challenges us to reframe our understanding of death. He encourages us to let go of the Western obsession with controlling the uncontrollable, and instead embrace death as part of the natural flow of existence. In doing so, he argues, we might free ourselves from the paralyzing fear that often keeps us from truly living. One of the reasons death is so taboo, especially in the modern world, is that it forces us to confront the limitations of our knowledge and power. Despite our technological advancements, despite all our scientific discoveries, death remains the one thing we cannot conquer, the one mystery that resists explanation. And this, perhaps more than anything, is what frightens us. In a world where we are taught to measure our success in terms of control over our environment, control over our bodies, control over our futures, the fact that death lies beyond our grasp is deeply unsettling. But what suggests that our need for control is precisely what prevents us from finding peace with death? By trying to dominate life, to force it to fit into neat categories, we miss the point. Life, according to Watts, is not something to be controlled or dominated. It is something to be experienced, something to be lived. And to truly live, we must accept the reality of death. For Watts, the fear of death is rooted in a misunderstanding of who we really are. Most of us go through life believing that we are separate individuals, distinct from the world around us. We see ourselves as isolated egos, cut off from the rest of the universe. This sense of separation makes death terrifying because it seems like the ultimate end, the final annihilation of the self. But Watts, drawing from the teachings of Buddhism and Vedanta, argues that this belief in a separate self is an illusion. We are not isolated beings, but part of the larger process of life itself. We are the universe experiencing itself in a temporary form, and death is simply the dissolution of that form back into the whole. He often used the metaphor of the ocean to illustrate this point. Just as a wave rises and falls, so too do we. The wave appears to have a distinct form, a separate identity, but it is never truly separate from the ocean. It is the ocean, in a particular expression, and when it falls back, it doesn't cease to exist. It simply returns to where it has always belonged. In the same way, we are not separate from the universe. We are like waves, temporary expressions of something far greater, and when we die, we return to the source from which we came. Watts' perspective on death invites us to let go of the ego-driven fear of oblivion. Instead of seeing death as the end of everything, we can see it as a transformation, a return to the broader flow of life. This view doesn't deny the pain and loss that death can bring, but it offers a different way of understanding that loss. It allows us to see death not as a defeat, but as a natural and necessary part of the cosmic process. In reframing death in this way, Watts also challenges the Western obsession with immortality. So much of our fear of death stems from the desire to live forever, to somehow cheat the natural order and hold on to life indefinitely. We see this in everything from the quest for eternal youth to the development of technologies aimed at prolonging life beyond its natural limits. But Watts suggests that this obsession with immortality is misguided. To live forever would be to rob life of its meaning, for it is the very impermanence of life that gives it its value. Imagine, for a moment, if there were no death. If life went on indefinitely, without change, without an end, would it still be life? Would we still treasure our experiences if we knew they would last forever? Watts argues that it is the fleeting nature of life that makes it precious. Death gives life its urgency, its beauty. It reminds us that every moment is unique, that every experience is irreplaceable. And so, rather than seeking to escape death, Watts invites us to embrace it. To live with the awareness of death is to live more fully, more presently. When we accept that our time is limited, we are freed from the illusion that we can waste it. We are freed from the distractions that keep us from fully engaging with life, from appreciating the present moment. In this sense, death is not the enemy of life, but its partner, its teacher. It is only by confronting the reality of death that we can truly understand the value of life. And this, according to Watts, is the great irony, that in accepting death, we are freed to live. One of the most profound ideas Alan Watts explores is the notion that the individual self, as we commonly understand it, is an illusion. This concept, which he draws from both Buddhist and Hindu traditions, challenges one of the core assumptions of Western thought, the belief in a separate, independent self. To Watts, this idea of the self as something distinct from the world around it is not only false, but also the root of much of our suffering, including our fear of death. From an early age, we are conditioned to believe that we are individual beings, separate from the world and others around us. Our language reinforces this idea. Consider how we speak of I versus you, mine versus yours, as if we were fundamentally distinct entities with clear boundaries. We are taught to view ourselves as autonomous agents, navigating a world that is somehow out there, apart from us. This sense of separateness gives rise to the fear of death because if we are truly separate, then death must be the end of the individual self, the ultimate obliteration of me. Watts invites us to reconsider this deeply ingrained notion. He suggests that what we perceive as the self is actually a mental construct, a collection of thoughts, memories, and perceptions that we mistakenly identify as a permanent, unchanging entity. But if we look closely, we can see that this self is not a fixed thing at all. It is constantly in flux, shaped and reshaped by our experiences and interactions with the world. The belief in a separate self is what the Buddhists call an Atman, or no self. According to this teaching, there is no enduring, independent self that exists apart from the rest of the universe. What we think of as me is simply a collection of processes, thoughts, feelings, sensations that arise and pass away moment by moment. These processes are interconnected with everything else in the universe, much like waves in the ocean. The wave appears to be a distinct entity, but it is not separate from the water. In the same way, we are not separate from the universe. We are part of its ever-changing flow. Watts often used this metaphor of the wave to illustrate the illusory nature of the self. A wave rises, moves across the surface of the ocean, and then falls back, disappearing from view. But at no point was the wave truly separate from the ocean. It was always an expression of the ocean, momentarily taking form before dissolving back into the whole. In the same way, our individual lives are temporary expressions of the universe, momentarily taking shape before dissolving back into the larger process of existence. The illusion of the separate self leads to many of the existential fears we face, especially the fear of death. If we believe that we are isolated beings, then death seems like the ultimate threat, an event that will destroy us, that will bring everything we are to an end. But if we can see through this illusion, if we can recognize that we are not truly separate from the world around us, then death loses much of its sting. Death is not the end of the self, because the self as we understand it never existed in the first place. What we call death is simply the dissolution of one form of existence, much like the wave returning to the ocean. This idea can be deeply unsettling at first because it undermines the sense of security we derive from our belief in a stable, individual self. We cling to the notion of I because it gives us a sense of continuity, a sense of being in control. But Watts argues that this sense of control is an illusion. The self is not something we possess or control. It is something that arises out of the ongoing interaction between our minds and the world. The belief in a separate self is an attempt to impose permanence and stability on something that is inherently fluid and dynamic. This is why Watts emphasizes the importance of letting go of the ego, the part of us that clings to the illusion of separateness. The ego is constantly trying to assert itself, to define itself in opposition to the world. I am this, not that. I am separate from you, separate from nature, separate from the universe. But this constant effort to maintain the illusion of separateness is exhausting and ultimately futile. The more we try to solidify the boundaries of the self, the more we cut ourselves off from the flow of life. In contrast, when we let go of the ego, when we stop trying to assert our separateness and instead recognize our interconnectedness with the universe, we experience a profound sense of peace and liberation. This is the essence of what Watts calls non-dualism, the understanding that there is no fundamental separation between the self and the world. In fact, the very idea of a separate self is a product of dualistic thinking, a way of dividing reality into subject and object, self and other. But this division is artificial. It doesn't reflect the true nature of reality. Watts often spoke of the limitations of language in reinforcing the illusion of the self. Language, by its very nature, divides the world into discrete categories: me and you, this and that. But reality, as Watts points out, is not divided in this way. Reality is a seamless whole, an interconnected web of relationships in which everything influences everything else. The sense of being a separate individual is, in large part, a byproduct of the way we use language to describe our experiences. In Eastern philosophy, particularly in Vedanta and Buddhism, this interconnectedness is often described as the self being part of a greater whole, what Hindus call Brahman, the ultimate reality or universal consciousness. The individual self, Atman, is not separate from this greater reality, but a manifestation of it. When we die, we do not cease to exist. We simply return to this greater reality, much like a drop of water returning to the ocean. The drop was never truly separate from the ocean to begin with, and when it returns, it does not lose its essence. It simply dissolves back into the larger whole. Watts encourages us to view death through this lens. If the self is not truly separate from the universe, then death is not the annihilation of the self, but a transformation. It is the dissolution of one form of existence and the return to the underlying unity from which we emerged. The fear of death arises from our identification with the ego, the illusory sense of separateness. But when we recognize that the self is not an isolated entity, that we are part of the ongoing process of the universe, death becomes less threatening. It is not an end, but a continuation, a return to the source. This understanding of the self as an illusion has profound implications for how we live our lives. When we are caught up in the belief in a separate self, we tend to approach life with a sense of scarcity and fear. We worry about what will happen to me. Will I succeed? Will I fail? Will I be remembered? Will I survive? But when we let go of this illusion, when we see ourselves as part of the larger flow of life, we begin to live with a sense of abundance and trust. We no longer feel the need to protect and preserve the ego, because we realize that the ego was never real to begin with. Watts often pointed out that much of our suffering arises from our refusal to accept impermanence. We cling to the idea of a permanent self because we are afraid of change, afraid of losing control. But change is the nature of life. Everything is in a constant state of flux, including the self. The more we resist this truth, the more we suffer. But when we embrace impermanence, when we accept that everything, including the self, is constantly changing, we find a kind of freedom. We no longer need to cling to the illusion of permanence, and in letting go, we open ourselves to the full experience of life. In the end, Watts invites us to see death not as a threat to the self, but as an invitation to wake up from the illusion of separateness. Death is not the enemy. It is a reminder that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. The ego, with all its fears and attachments, may resist this truth, but deep down, we already know it. We already know that we are not separate from the universe, but a part of its ongoing dance. And when we remember this, we find that there is nothing to fear. Death is simply the next step in that dance, the moment when the wave returns to the ocean, and the illusion of separateness dissolves into the greater whole. One of the most profound realizations Alan Watts often presented is that life and death are not opposites in the way that most of us believe. Rather, they are two aspects of the same process, two sides of the same coin, inseparable from one another. This insight is central to Watts's philosophy, and it fundamentally challenges the way most of us think about our existence. In the modern world, we tend to think of life and death as completely distinct states. Life is something to be cherished, nurtured, and prolonged for as long as possible, while death is something to be feared, resisted, and avoided. This dualistic way of thinking has been ingrained in us by Western culture, which celebrates life while simultaneously denying or even vilifying death. We cling to life as if it were a possession, something we can own and control, while treating death as a hostile force waiting to snatch it away. But Watts, deeply influenced by Eastern philosophies such as Taoism and Buddhism, encourages us to see beyond this simplistic dualism. In these traditions, life and death are not seen as separate, but as interdependent aspects of a larger whole. They are like the crest and the trough of a wave, distinct in appearance, but part of the same movement. One cannot exist without the other. In Taoism, this unity of life and death is often expressed through the concept of yin and yang, two opposite forces that are constantly interacting, creating the dynamic flow of the universe. Yin and yang are not fixed or rigid categories, but are always shifting and transforming into each other. Just as night turns into day and winter into summer, so too does life transform into death, and death into life. To the Taoist mind, there is no fundamental opposition between life and death, just as there is no opposition between inhaling and exhaling. They are simply different expressions of the same underlying reality. Watts beautifully adopts this Taoist understanding, using the metaphor of breathing to explain the relationship between life and death. He often spoke of life as the in-breath and death as the out-breath, two actions that are essential parts of a single process. Without one, the other could not exist. Imagine trying to breathe without ever exhaling, or exhaling without ever inhaling. It's impossible. In the same way, life and death are mutually dependent. We live because we will die, and we die because we have lived. They are not antagonistic forces locked in eternal conflict, but complementary aspects of the same natural rhythm. What makes this understanding so transformative is that it invites us to stop fearing death as something that stands outside or apart from life. Instead, we are encouraged to see death as an integral part of the life process itself. Just as the leaves fall from the trees in autumn to make way for new growth in the spring, so too does death create the conditions for new life to arise. This cycle of birth, death, and rebirth is not a mistake or a tragedy. It is the very essence of nature. The problem arises, Watts argues, when we try to hold on to life as if it were a static thing. In the West, we have a tendency to treat life as something we can preserve indefinitely. We build systems, structures, and even personal identities around the idea of permanence, as though life could be frozen in time, immune to change. But this is not how life works. Life is change. Life is flux. And just as life moves forward through constant transformation, so too must it move toward death, because death is the culmination of life's process of change. This brings us to another key aspect of Watts's thought: the idea that death is not an interruption of life, but its natural conclusion. We often think of death as something that happens to life, as though life were a river that flows along until it is suddenly and violently cut off. But Watts asks us to reconsider this notion. What if, instead of thinking of death as the end of life, we thought of it as the fulfillment of life? What if, rather than being the termination of our existence, death was simply the completion of a cycle, like the final note in a symphony? Watts often pointed out that the beauty of a piece of music lies not only in the notes that are played, but also in the silences between them. If there were no silence, no pauses, no conclusion, the music would lose its meaning and coherence. In the same way, life without death would be an incomplete melody, lacking its natural rhythm and resolution. Just as a song must come to an end in order to have been fully played, so too must life come to an end in order to have been fully lived. This perspective is deeply rooted in non-dualistic thought, which sees all of existence as interconnected and interdependent. In this view, the boundaries we draw between life and death are arbitrary and artificial. Life does not stop when we die, because life is not limited to the individual. Just as a wave on the ocean rises and falls, but is never truly separate from the water, so too do we rise and fall within the vast, interconnected web of existence. Our individual lives are like waves, temporary, ever-changing forms that arise from the ocean of being and return to it when their time is done. This metaphor of the wave is one that Watts returned to again and again because it so beautifully captures the essence of his teaching. The wave, while it exists, has a distinct form. It moves, it crashes, it interacts with other waves. But at no point is it separate from the ocean. When the wave falls, It does not die in the way we usually think of death. It simply dissolves back into the ocean, from which it may rise again in another form. In this way, life and death are not opposites, but stages in a continuous process of becoming. Watt's understanding of life and death as complementary forces is also deeply informed by Buddhist teachings, particularly the concept of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. In Buddhist thought, life and death are not distinct states, but part of the same ongoing cycle of existence. Death is not an end, but a transition, a moment of transformation that leads to new forms of life. Just as one season gives way to another, so too does death give rise to new life. This cyclical view of life and death encourages us to see our own mortality not as a cause for despair, but as an opportunity for renewal. Death is not the destruction of life, but its renewal in a different form. The same forces that bring life into being also bring death, and the same forces that bring death also bring life. They are part of the same creative process, constantly transforming one into the other. Watts was keenly aware of how this understanding contrasts with the Western view of death, which tends to see it as the final enemy. In the West, death is often portrayed as something to be conquered or overcome, whether through scientific advancements, religious salvation, or even the pursuit of immortality. But in trying to conquer death, we often end up denying life. We become so focused on avoiding death that we forget to truly live. One of the great ironies Watts pointed out is that our fear of death often leads us to live in a state of anxiety and tension. We become so preoccupied with preserving life, with holding on to what we have, that we miss the beauty and spontaneity of the present moment. We cling to life so tightly that we lose our ability to experience it fully. In trying to resist death, we end up resisting life as well. But what if, instead of resisting death, we embraced it as part of the natural order? What if we saw death not as a threat, but as a companion, a necessary counterpart to life? Watts suggests that by accepting death as an integral part of existence, we can free ourselves from the fear that so often constrains us. When we stop trying to control life, when we let go of the need to preserve, prolong, and protect our individual selves, we open ourselves up to a deeper experience of life itself. In this sense, death is not the end of life, but its teacher. It reminds us that everything is temporary, that all forms are fleeting, and that the only constant is change. By confronting death, by accepting its inevitability, we can learn to live with greater awareness, greater appreciation, and greater freedom. Death teaches us to let go of our attachments, to stop clinging to the illusion of permanence, and to embrace the transient nature of existence. Ultimately, for Watts, the relationship between life and death is not one of opposition, but of balance. Life and death are not enemies. They are partners in the great dance of existence. They are like the ebb and flow of the tide, the rise and fall of a breath, the beginning and end of a story. And just as the beauty of a story lies not only in its beginning, but also in its ending, so too does the beauty of life lie not only in its living, but also in its dying. In recognizing this, we can begin to approach life with a sense of wonder and gratitude. We can live more fully, more deeply, knowing that each moment is precious precisely because it is fleeting. And in doing so, we can also approach death with a sense of peace, knowing that it is not the negation of life, but its fulfillment, the final note in the great symphony of existence. In the modern Western world, death is often treated as something to be feared, avoided, or even denied. It looms as a shadowy figure, lurking at the end of life's journey, something to be dreaded and fought against at all costs. Alan Watts frequently pointed out that this intense fear of death is a particularly Western phenomenon, rooted in the cultural, religious, and philosophical traditions that have shaped the Western mind for centuries. This fear of death, Watts argued, is not only unnecessary, but also a reflection of a deeper misunderstanding of the nature of life and existence. To understand the Western fear of death, we must first look at the way death has been framed in Western thought, particularly in relation to religion and the concept of the self. In much of Western philosophy and theology, death has been viewed as a kind of ultimate defeat, a tragic end to the individual's journey. This stems largely from the influence of dualistic thinking, which divides the world into opposites: life and death, body and soul, good and evil. In this framework, death is seen as the opposite of life, an event that marks the annihilation of the self, or at the very least, a profound loss. In Christian theology, for example, death is often portrayed as the consequence of sin, a punishment for humanity's fall from grace. It is something to be overcome through salvation and the promise of eternal life. This notion of death as a penalty has deeply shaped the Western psyche, casting it as something unnatural, a disruption of life's natural order. Instead of being viewed as part of the cycle of existence, death is framed as an intruder, an enemy that must be vanquished. The Christian doctrine of heaven and hell further intensifies the fear of death. For many, death is not just the end of physical life, but the point at which one's eternal fate is decided. The idea of an afterlife, where one might experience eternal bliss or eternal damnation, has led to profound anxiety about what comes after death. This anxiety has, over time, evolved into a cultural obsession with the idea of immortality, whether through religious salvation, scientific advancements, or simply the preservation of youth and vitality. Watts was highly critical of this Western obsession with immortality. He pointed out that the fear of death in Western culture is often tied to a rigid sense of individualism, the belief that each person is a unique, isolated entity that must persist indefinitely. This belief in the separate self, as we've discussed, is one of the central illusions that Watts sought to dispel. If we believe that we are fundamentally separate from the rest of existence, then death appears as a terrifying void, the end of everything we know as me. But Watts invites us to question this assumption. What if the self is not a fixed, isolated entity, but something fluid and interconnected with the rest of the universe? What if life and death are not opposites, but two aspects of the same process? If we can shift our perspective in this way, death no longer seems like such a frightening prospect. Instead of being the destruction of the self, it becomes a natural part of the flow of existence, a moment of transformation rather than obliteration. This idea stands in stark contrast to the Western approach to death, which has often been characterized by a deep sense of denial. In the modern age, particularly in Western societies, death has been increasingly removed from public consciousness. The dying are often isolated in hospitals or nursing homes, and the rituals surrounding death, such as funerals, have become sanitized and formalized, stripped of their emotional and spiritual depth. We have pushed death to the margins of life, treating it as something that happens behind closed doors, out of sight and out of mind. This denial of death, Watts argued, is ultimately harmful because it prevents us from fully engaging with life. By pretending that death is something that only happens to other people, or something that can be delayed indefinitely, we miss the opportunity to confront our own mortality, and in doing so, come to a deeper understanding of what it means to be alive. The irony, as Watts often pointed out, is that the more we try to avoid thinking about death, the more we are haunted by it. The fear of death becomes a constant undercurrent in our lives, subtly shaping our thoughts, actions, and emotions, even when we are not consciously aware of it. One of the ways this fear manifests is through the Western fixation on control. In Western culture, there is a strong emphasis on controlling life, on mastering the forces of nature, achieving progress, and extending life as much as possible. Medicine, technology, and science have all been directed toward the goal of conquering death, or at least postponing it for as long as possible. We develop new treatments, extend lifespans, and even explore the possibility of digital immortality, all in an attempt to keep death at bay. Watts was not opposed to medical advancements or the alleviation of suffering, but he cautioned against the belief that death could or should be completely controlled. To him, the desire to dominate life and death was symptomatic of a deeper spiritual crisis, a refusal to accept the natural rhythms of existence. He suggested that our attempts to conquer death, whether through science or through religious promises of eternal life, are ultimately futile because they stem from a misunderstanding of what death actually is. Death is not something to be conquered, it is something to be understood and accepted. In many Eastern traditions, particularly in Buddhism and Taoism, death is viewed not as an end, but as a transformation, a return to the source from which life arises. Watts frequently referred to these traditions in his lectures, highlighting how they approach death with a sense of acceptance and even reverence. In these cultures, death is not feared in the same way it is in the West, because it is seen as part of the natural order of things. Just as the day gives way to night, and the seasons follow their cycles, so too does life give way to death, and death to new life. The Buddhist concept of impermanence, the idea that all things are constantly changing, and that nothing lasts forever, is central to this understanding. For Buddhists, clinging to life or resisting death only causes suffering, because it goes against the fundamental nature of reality. Instead of fearing death, Buddhists are encouraged to meditate on it, to reflect on its inevitability, and to come to terms with it. This practice is not morbid or depressing, rather, it is seen as a way to cultivate wisdom and compassion. By acknowledging the impermanence of life, we learn to appreciate each moment more fully and to live with a greater sense of ease and acceptance. Watts was deeply influenced by this Buddhist perspective, and he often spoke about how Westerners could benefit from adopting a similar attitude toward death. He believed that if we could come to terms with the impermanence of life, we would not only reduce our fear of death, but also enhance our experience of life itself. When we accept that everything, including our own lives, is transient, we become less attached to the things that cause us suffering, our possessions, our status, our need for control, and more open to the flow of existence. In his lectures, Watts frequently used the metaphor of a dance to describe life. He suggested that life is like a dance or a piece of music. It is not about reaching a particular destination or outcome, but about fully engaging in the process. The beauty of a dance lies in the movement itself, not in the final step. The joy of music comes from the notes being played, not from the silence that follows. In the same way, the meaning of life is found in living fully, moment by moment, without being fixated on the end. But to dance well, Watts argued, we must be willing to let go. We must be willing to surrender to the rhythm of life, to trust in the process, and to accept that, eventually, the dance will end. This does not mean that we should seek death or live recklessly, but rather that we should stop trying to resist the inevitable. When we stop clinging to life out of fear of death, we can begin to live with greater freedom, joy, and spontaneity. In contrast, the Western approach to life and death often feels like a race or a competition, a struggle to achieve as much as possible before time runs out. We are constantly driven by the fear that we are running out of time, that we need to accomplish more, accumulate more, or experience more before we die. This frantic pace leaves little room for the kind of deep reflection and inner peace that comes from accepting death as a natural part of life. Watts argued that this fear-based approach to life and death ultimately impoverishes our experience of both. When we are constantly trying to outrun death, we lose the ability to be present in the moment. We become so focused on what might happen in the future, on avoiding death, extending life, or achieving immortality, that we forget to appreciate the simple, fleeting beauty of the here and now.